So today's talk is called Framing the Civil Rights Movement. The basic idea of it is that I hope that it generates some ideas and some discussion about how we should think about the civil rights movement, and more importantly, how we tell the story of the civil rights movement. My hope is that it can give us ways to help think about the civil rights movement as perhaps more dynamic and for our students more relatable sometimes than they tend to think, or they tend to think of the civil rights movement as something that's distant in the past and not connected to their own personal experience. And I hope that it will help them to see it as more intimately connected to themselves and to their worlds. But I also hope that it helps them to see history itself as something that is more complicated, more up for interpretation, than we sometimes have the stereotype of history as just this recitation of facts and great deeds. And ideally, they'll be able to fuse different interpretations together. Part of what makes it a sophisticated mind and what we hope we instill in our students is the ability to put competing ideas into conversation with each other and to achieve some kind of synthesis or consensus through them. So I hope we do a little bit of that today. I'll be moving fast in terms of the historical material. So I won't be dwelling on any particular moment, I don't think for quite a long time. But please do feel free to ask me to follow up about any particular issue that I bring up. You can drop comments into the chat and questions into the chat, and of course we can discuss them visually as well after the presentation. In next week's webinar, I'll dive more into some specific people and into one particular historical moment, thinking about, we'll look at some documents from Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, perhaps some others, and we'll focus on one particular chunk of civil rights history to try to give you sort of a more specific plan. Today is designed to be sort of more of a framing question, so to speak. To that end, I gave it to Brian yesterday, a very brief essay from Charles Cobb. It's in a relatively new book called 400 Souls, which is this community history of African Americans, where each author takes up 5 years in African American history and is designed to cover those years. So Charles Cobb's task was the first half of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. And Cobb is, the reason that I chose this document in particular is because he is both a scholar. As you can see from the bottom photo here, he is someone who has been who's written on the movement. His last book was called "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed." It was about sort of the role of self-defense in the civil rights movement. But he was also an activist within the movement itself. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so the story that he tells, how does he describe the civil rights movement? What's the story he tells, right? Is one that it reflects in a lot of ways his experience. Here's a guy who was a SNCC activist. He went to Howard. He was a field secretary in the Mississippi Delta in the early 1960s. If you've heard of the Freedom Schools during Freedom Summer, Cobb was the architect of that idea. When he tells the story of the civil rights movement, right, Martin Luther King is not at the center of his story. He tells the story through the sit-ins, through the students themselves, and also through the figure of Ella Baker, right, who was the woman who's almost like the mother of SNCC in that sense. A woman who faced sexism when she was part of Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The woman who encouraged SNCC to become its own organization, to realizing that the students would be kind of like the militant vanguard of the movement. She also had a very different vision of what political change looks like. There's much more of a sort of a vision of bottom-up grassroots organizing rather than the ideal of the charismatic preacher that King tended to embody. She's famous for the slogan, the idea of bigger than a hamburger. What you're doing with the sit-ins when you're sitting in at these lunch counters isn't about a hamburger, it is about a whole slate of elements of human justice, including economic rights. And when Cobb talks about the violence that they face, he's not talking about the violence that maybe most Americans are familiar with in terms of thinking about the civil rights movement, the violence in opposition to nonviolent demonstrations. When we think of violence in the movement, we think of the fire hoses in Birmingham or the police dogs attacking people or nightsticks, right? But what Cobb is writing about is the violence faced by these grassroots organizers, the people who are in the homes of Black people in places like the Mississippi Delta, the experiences of activists in SNCC and CORE who are doing this kind of sort of patient work to try to develop political strength within communities. And they would face, shots from night riders and Klan attacks and so on, the kinds of things that weren't on the nightly news. And so with that, he emphasizes the resilience of Black communities themselves. So this is one story of the civil rights movement. It's not the only way to tell the story of the civil rights movement. But if this is his take, right? If this is his contribution to a book of African-American history about what the civil rights movement was like in these very formative years in the early 1960s, it speaks to the fact that there is no one way to tell that story. And so in framing the movement more largely, what I hope to do today is to give you kind of two stories of the civil rights movement. One is the more traditional story, right? What I would call here the old civil rights history. And I don't mean it in a pejorative way, more than so that this is the draft of the civil rights movement that was established by the first generation of people who'd been active in the movement and wrote about it, but also a lot of the journalists who were reporting on the movement and wrote about the big moments in that history, the kind of stuff that really made the news and drove the story. What is this version of the civil rights movement? It is rooted in the South, right? In overturning Jim Crow in the South. It tends to center upon Martin Luther King, the most central figure in the civil rights movement, the person who best articulated and most frequently articulated the goals of the movement, this compelling figure. It is a story that is bounded by the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called Montgomery to Memphis narrative, right? The Montgomery bus boycott beginning in 1955, King's assassination in 1968 is kind of the bookends, so to speak, King's emergence and King's death, right? Serving as the sort of the narrative arc of the civil rights movement. In this version of the story, most of the characters are male. The heads of the civil rights organizations, the figures like A. Philip Randolph, the Martin Luther Kings, the Roy Wilkins, the Malcolm X, the Stokely Carmichael. In this version of the story, nonviolent demonstrations are at the heart of it, right? Those were the big campaigns that tended to generate the kind of national attention that stimulated the national conscience. If you think about the Montgomery bus boycott, if you think about the Little Rock crisis, if you think about the student sit-ins and the freedom rides and the Birmingham campaign, right? These are all sort of elements of that story. It's a story, this version of the civil rights movement, of one that in many ways is successful, a story of triumph, right? Because Jim Crow, the legal forms of Jim Crow in the South were destroyed, and particularly through key pieces of federal legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it's also a story that tells the story, this classic narrative is one that of declension, of decline, that by the late 60s, the movement is deteriorating. BlackPower has arisen as a competing philosophy. There's urban riots, King is assassinated. There's a white working class backlash against the movement, and all these things sort of bring an end to them, right? So we're going to discuss that old civil rights history. But I also want to look at the so-called, what you might call the new civil rights history. And here's sort of a generation of scholars, maybe two generations of scholars, who have tried to reframe the civil rights movement, who have emphasized the parts that weren't caught by the first draft, right? And so they tend to see a more national story, that this isn't simply confined to the South. The civil rights movement stretches into the North and into the West. One that looks to the local, one that looks, what does the civil rights movement look like in a particular city, in a particular community, in a particular region? And that doesn't necessarily follow the story of the so-called old civil rights movement. Part of the framework of many of these historians, what we might call the idea of the long civil rights movement, one that stretches beyond the 50s and 60s, one that looks further deep into the past and stretches beyond the 60s themselves and sees a larger continuum of Black activism beyond those times. This is also a trend in the scholarship to see how central women were to the civil rights movement, to see that women were key components within the movement, but also played essential roles that help us see the movement in new ways, through new angles, and we'll discuss that as well. Other themes here include the international context, not just on the local, but on the global, and that people, that African Americans of this era are paying attention to larger global developments and shaping their struggle. The idea of armed self-defense, the idea of that not all people engage in nonviolent action, didn't see that as the most efficacious way to achieve racial change, right? These are all aspects of this trend. And lastly, we might see BlackPower not just as the bad guy in the story, not just as the boogeyman, but rather as an affirmative force, right? The BlackPower was brought about positive change for African Americans and was a very empowering idea and slogan and philosophy. One thing that I hope that you'll get from the approach that I'm trying to bring is that there's not one is not wrong and the other is not right. Rather, they are both two ways to tell a story. And I think it is essential for us to think about them in conversation with each other. So think about the old civil rights history and the new civil rights history as simultaneously existing. And that can help us create a more sort of complex picture of what it meant to fight for racial justice in these extremely transformative years. Okay, so what does that old civil rights framework look like? Some of this, I assume, is going to be familiar material to most, right? When we think about sort of what the old civil rights history is built around, it's often built around the big, what we all might call flashpoints, the stories that compelled national attention, the stories that get recycled into our popular memory, the ones that we create heroes out of. And again, these follow that sort of old civil rights track: Southern, mostly male, nonviolent, right? A story of gradual triumph over time. So this is a story that will include, for instance, the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. This is the key Supreme Court legislation that overturns the doctrine of separate but equal, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. The meaning of this decision is not just a political achievement. It's not just sort of dawning a new era, but it also provides a constitutional foundation for the civil rights movement to follow, right? But when people are sitting in at lunch counters, when they are challenging bus segregation, they're doing so now with some backing of the U.S. Constitution in a way that did not exist prior. Another sort of key foundational moment in the 50s is, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott. Everyone knows the story of Rosa Parks, right? The story of a woman who is a seamstress, who boards a bus in Montgomery and refuses to give up her seat, gets arrested. It sparks a boycott that's originally lasts 1 day, then lasts 3 days, then it ends up lasting 383 days. And over that time, the Supreme Court overturns segregation in Montgomery's buses, but it also it stimulates the activism of the Black community. And so Rosa Parks emerges as this key figure, and so too does Martin Luther King, right? At the time, just a 26-year-old minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He emerges as the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association and just becomes this exceptionally compelling national figure, the kind of guy who was on the cover of Time magazine by the end of the boycott, and who gives voice to the aspirations and to the ideas of the movement. And then in terms of thinking about sort of the merging, so to speak, of the Brown decision and this Black activism, the focus in the national story shifts to Little Rock, Arkansas, where in 1957, the NAACP is supporting these 9 African-American children, the so-called Little Rock 9, who are going to integrate Central High School, the big flagship high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they're blocked by the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, who uses the state guard to keep out these children. And ultimately, this creates such a crisis that the federal government has to intervene. Dwight Eisenhower orders the 101st Airborne to protect these 9 children through this tumultuous year. So this is a story that reveals both the courage of these Black children, the ultimate siding of the federal government with the case of the Little Rock 9, but also the intransigence of these white segregationists who engage in what we might call massive resistance, trying to block any element of racial integration, like Faubus, who in fact the next year closes the Little Rock schools rather than continue this integration. So these are all, again, key foundational stories, and everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with the big outline of that story. To continue in this path into the early 1960s, we see, as Charles Cobb was writing about with the student sit-ins, right? This is the beginnings of building a real mass movement. You've got a generation, a young generation, Charles Cobb's generation, that have these rising expectations, right? They were the age of Emmett Till when Emmett Till was killed in 1955. They were teenagers in context of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. They're coming to maturity at a time of mass consumerism and television and expectations of a better life. And what they're finding is that Jim Crow continues to dictate the terms of their life. And so the most activist and courageous of them end up in these sit-ins that start in Greensboro, North Carolina, that spread throughout the South, that ultimately involve 70,000 demonstrators doing not just sit-ins, but wade-ins at beaches and read-ins at libraries and all sorts of mass marches. They bring a new grassroots energy to the civil rights movement. The next year is the Freedom Rides, which starts with 13 people interracial group of activists who start riding buses from Washington, D.C. into the Deep South with the idea that they're going to test a new Supreme Court ruling that says that not only do buses have to be, that engage in interstate travel have to be desegregated, but so too do the terminals, right? So drinking fountains and shoe shines and restaurants and everything else in those terminals have to be desegregated. So they decide to test this. They face enormous violence in Alabama, where they face a mob attack in both Anniston, Alabama, and two in Birmingham. They can no longer continue the rides, but more activists flood through the South on these freedom rides, sparking local movements throughout the South and bringing more national attention to the moral injustice, so to speak, of Jim Crow. And then the next year, we have the courageous James Meredith, a 30-year-old Air Force veteran who applies to the University of Mississippi, the all-white University of Mississippi. And then that turns into a case that forces the NAACP to defend him. And that leads to the federal government having to defend his right to stay at the University of Mississippi. He has to be protected by U.S. Marshals after this gross violence that occurs upon his registration that results in 2 people dying. And so again, we see this intransigence of white segregationists, Black courage, and the federal government sort of slowly coming over to the role of stepping up for African Americans and their role in American democracy. And then it hits its peak in the mid 60s, right? We have the Birmingham Campaign of 1963. We have, this is the campaign that is led by Martin Luther King's organization that vaults King into a new level of prominence in American life, where he writes the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. It's this type of activity that will ultimately win him the Nobel Peace Prize. But the nation is also riveted by the pictures of children being marched off to jail in the so-called Children's Crusade in the midst of this. They see Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses being attacking Black demonstrators. It's stoking the national conscience and stimulating demonstrations in the summer of 1963 throughout the country to bring about an end to desegregation. And then at the end of that summer, of course, is the famous March on Washington, where 250,000 people, 50,000 of whom are white and 200,000 of whom are African American, come for one day to Washington, D.C. and listen to speeches by civil rights leaders and religious leaders. And it's all on national television. And by this point, John F. Kennedy has called for a civil rights bill. And so the leaders meet with Kennedy in the aftermath. And of course, it's most famous for King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. So in all these ways, right, we're seeing that old civil rights movement narrative at work, right? The last key element of that story, perhaps, is the story of Selma in 1965. This is a fight for voting rights in a city in Alabama of about 30,000 people. That's about 15,000 of whom are African American, but virtually none have the right to vote. And again, they face exceptional white violence. A man named Jimmy Lee Jackson is killed by the police. That leads to the idea to march from Selma to Montgomery. And that's where they face the violence of so-called Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they're attacked. And again, they need the intervention of the federal government to protect their right to march. And it's a triumphant march that ultimately helps to speed the passage of the Voting Rights Act of '65. And so that's the next piece here, right? Beyond simply the in the sort of classic old civil rights history tale, we see a federal government that sort of comes over time to understand the legitimacy of the Black cause, to put its weight behind it, and to pass the 2 key pieces of legislation that we associate with the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that helps to bring about the desegregation of public facilities. It provides the federal government through the Attorney General with the ability to wage suits to bring about school desegregation. It creates the Equal Employment Opportunities Council to combat workplace discrimination. It sort of brings about the demise of Jim Crow as we know it. And then the Voting Rights Act the next year in '65 combats the issue of Black disfranchisement. Right? It says if Southern states are discriminating in terms of who they allow to register and who they allow to vote, then the federal government will intervene, and does so to help register voters and to oversee elections. And if there's a redrawing of voting lines, then the federal government's going to oversee it to make sure that it's not racially biased. So this is, a story of eradicating Jim Crow, right, in this old civil rights history. And it is a story that ends, right? It's a story of a movement in decline. as I was suggesting at the beginning of the talk, right? You have the philosophy of Black Power that is in opposition to the civil rights movement as it's portrayed here, right? If the civil rights movement was about the brotherhood of man and was, King's ideals were of nonviolent demonstrations and of racial integration, right? And Black Power argues for Black self-determination, and it rejects nonviolence as a core guiding philosophy. It argues that Black people have to control their own destiny, so to speak. But to many whites, it's read at the time as hostile and as against their interests. Of course, they're influenced by this time, the slain Malcolm X, who was dead in 1965, but who became sort of an intellectual forebear from the Black Power movement. So Black Power in this tale sort of alienates whites from supporting the movement. So too does the intensification of violence in American cities, the rioting that occurs in New York in '64, in Watts in '65, especially in Newark and Detroit in 1967. Where these are sort of, this kind of like violence turned inward, what sociologists call commodity riots, in which people attack and burn and destroy what they see as the symbols of their oppression. White-owned stores, they spar with police, but it turns inward, and it is seen as, particularly by '67, it inspires a lot of sort of liberal hand-wringing about the future of Black progress if this is occurring. And then the end of this story, as it's told, is with King's assassination in April of 1968 in Memphis, which sparks even more urban riots, and it's a time of uncertainty and despair in Black America. So this is the classic civil rights tale as we know it. Come back to this slide, right? The idea of framing the movement, right? That's the old civil rights history. Well, is it true? In some ways, sure, right? This is if it's a first draft of history, it's more complicated than this, but there is many elements that make this really a viable way to tell the story of the civil rights movement. It's focused on the South, sure, but the South is unique in a lot of ways. Jim Crow is, as a legal form, is specific to the Southern states. The level of violence that African Americans face is most extraordinary in the South. It's where there's also the most significant and most widespread activism to try to combat those forces. In terms of thinking about periodization, it is a very distinct period in African American history. It is unique to see this sort of mass mobilization of people and forcing the agenda of African American politics onto the nation, right? There are many times when Black politics have been on the back burner, in the larger national political conversation. But the movement forces that to not be the case. There is this really sort of specific, unique element of Black action and national response in the late 50s and particularly the early 1960s. It's a story that is centered around Martin Luther King, yes, but Martin Luther King is a unique and compelling figure, right? As I was suggesting earlier in our talk today, who but Martin Luther King is the articulator of the most noble ideals of the African American struggle, right? Where Martin Luther King goes, cameras follow. Where Martin Luther King goes, reporters follow. Where Martin Luther King goes, people follow. He has a special status in many ways in the movement in his time. As one example of this, Gallup, the national poll organization, would ask Americans every year who are the most admired Americans, and King would almost always fell in the top 10 of that list. But they also asked who's the most hated American, and Martin Luther King would also fall in the top 10 on those lists as well. He was this very central figure in terms of understanding civil rights and the Black struggle in the 1960s. It is again, this is a story that focuses mostly on men, and men were at the forefront. Men were the ones who were interviewed by the reporters. Men were the ones who appeared before the television cameras. It is a story that focuses on nonviolence, but again, nonviolent direct action. The big protests such as the sit-ins or the Birmingham Campaign or Bloody Sunday, that's what compelled the national attention that helped to bring about change. The civil rights legislation of '64 and '65 was exceptionally significant. They rewrote Southern history. And there was, in fact, a decline in political support for the cause of Black freedom by the late 1960s. In that moment, there was a lot of sort of liberal hand-wringing about where to go, and there was a more effective conservative backlash against where the movement was going. So all these things are true. And yet, you might argue that if we simply just take this story, then it creates a kind of mythology that might be a little misleading, even dangerous. So this is a quote from Julian Bond. If Julian Bond, like Charles Cobb, was a member of SNCC, again, probably the most militant of the civil rights organizations. He was, Bond in particular was a particularly polished person who moved into formal politics. He ran for Congress in Georgia in 1966. Before that, he was a communications director. And then himself, he became a scholar of the movement, like Cobb himself. So here's his story of the civil rights movement that he's saying, if you look at the bottom, I wrote, this is him saying it tongue in cheek. He did not actually believe this is an accurate story of the civil rights movement, but this is what he sees as kind of like the myth of the civil rights movement. Traditionally, relationships between the races in the South were oppressive. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided this was wrong. Inspired by the court, courageous Americans, Black and white, took protests to the streets in the form of sit-ins, bus boycotts, and freedom rides. The protest movement, led by the brilliant and eloquent Dr. Martin Luther King, aided by a sympathetic federal government, most notably the Kennedy brothers and a born-again Lyndon Johnson, was able to make America understand racial discrimination as a moral issue. Once Americans understood that discrimination was wrong, they quickly moved to remove racial prejudice and discrimination from American life, as evidenced by the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. Dr. King was tragically slain in 1968. Fortunately, by that time, the country had been changed for the better in some fundamental ways. The movement was a remarkable victory for all Americans. By the 1970s, Southern states where Blacks could not have voted 10 years earlier were sending African Americans to Congress. Inexplicably, just as the civil rights victories were piling up, many Black Americans under the banner of Black Power turned their backs on American society. So again, he's saying this tongue in cheek, right? This isn't Bond's version of the civil rights movement. This is a man who was active in the movement himself. But he sees it as potentially problematic to frame the movement as this. We saw a problem in terms of racial discrimination, in terms of Jim Crow. Black people heroically stepped up to the fore. White people saw that they were right and quickly remedied those issues. And then there was Black Power, and we don't understand why, and we don't understand why this all sort of declined. Right? It's kind of like it's almost like mocking a traditionally liberal account of the civil rights movement. So he sees a problem with this. He sees this as, if you understand the movement in this way, are you choking off the possibility of a more complex understanding of the movement, of understanding that it wasn't simple by any means to convince the federal government to pass this kind of remedial legislation, that it took a decade of work, that even with the passage of the Brown decision in 1954, schools, for instance, weren't significantly desegregated in the South until the very end of the 1960s and the early 1970s. That the federal government was at best a reluctant ally, as most civil rights activists understood it, and that Black Power grew out of the movement. That Black Power was something that was fundamental, that was necessary for African Americans. This is part of Bond's understanding of it. So let's, again, here's the so-called new civil rights history. That is, just to review again, it's national rather than just simply Southern. It is local, not just where the big flashpoints are. It stretches beyond the 50s and 60s through this idea of the long civil rights framework. It accounts for the roles of women. It accounts for global politics. It questions nonviolence as the only strategy of the civil rights movement. And it sees Black Power, again, as more of an affirmative rather than a negative force. So how does that play out? Let me try to give you some examples of what this new civil rights movement style scholarship looks like. We can understand civil rights as occurring not just in the South, but in the North and in the West, right? When we typically think about a Northern city or as active in the civil rights movement, they tend to only pop up in sort of that big national story at the end of the 1960s with the urban riots, with Black Power. You don't find like monuments to civil rights history in any sort of substantial way in the North as the way you might in the South. People refer to it as, the idea of de facto segregation as opposed to de jure. De jure segregation is segregation by law. De facto as if it just sort of occurs, but the implication is if it's just almost by accident. But in fact, there were African Americans who were active in mass demonstrations by the tens of thousands who didn't live in the South, who engaged in direct action, who engaged in economic boycotts, who engaged in grassroots organizing, who did all the things that combated segregation in schools and jobs, all the things that we associate with the civil rights movement. Let me just give you one example from New York City. In New York City, the big primary battleground for civil rights was over school desegregation. The schools were segregated. And they weren't segregated by law, but they were segregated by neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods had been segregated based on the practices of redlining going back to the 1930s and 1940s, which basically confined where people could buy homes or could get federally insured mortgages and excluded Black neighborhoods from those things through the red lines on those maps. And that helped to choke off the growth of the Black middle class and Black home ownership. And often also Black people faced violence when they integrated into neighborhoods that were primarily white. We see this particularly in cities like New York and Chicago. And so for all these reasons, schools practiced a version of racial segregation, also sort of in very creative ways in which the school boundaries were drawn. And so Black activists in New York, along with ultimately Puerto Rican activists as well, were challenging the Board of Education, engaging in massive resistance, engaging in trying to elect their own officials, creating their own desegregation plans. People like Ella Baker were instrumental in this movement. And yet it doesn't get the same kind of attention because it doesn't sort of compel the same national mythology. Even within that time, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, one of the key architects of it was a liberal congressman from New York named Emanuel Seller. Seller was instrumental in making sure that the legislation about school desegregation did not affect anywhere except the South. And this was a way to garner support in the North for that civil rights legislation, knowing that it wouldn't affect desegregation, for instance, in the South. So from the Black perspective on the ground in a city like New York, you might see more similarities than differences in the kind of activism that they're engaging in with that of the South. But the story gets told in a very different way. So that's one example, right? And you have more historians who are focused on what Black activism looked like in the 50s and 60s in northern cities, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, in Boston. There have been a number of New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, terrific studies that have been done by scholars about this. Maybe the most dominant trend in the civil rights scholarship since the 1990s has been more of a focus on what we call local movements. One of the trends is to look at what does the movement look like in this particular city or in this particular region. And these have been done anywhere from the Mississippi Delta to a city like Atlanta to rural North Carolina to you name it. And what these studies highlight is that when you look at a movement on the ground, when you look at what did Black political progress or what did Black social progress look like in this particular region, it doesn't necessarily follow the Montgomery to Memphis timeline. It could be shaped by those things. It could be shaped, for instance, by the Brown decision or the 64 Civil Rights Act. But those aren't the only elements that shape that story. Often the activism is consistent going back to the 30s and 40s and often doesn't just stop in the 1960s, as you might imagine. It might intersect with the national story, but it is its own thing and follows its own timeline. It also means that the people are different. There's different sort of what we call historical actors, right? Different people who are driving that change. The people who matter the most when you tell the story of the civil rights movement in the Mississippi Delta, for instance, Martin Luther King doesn't matter much to that story. Martin Luther King is an admired figure among African Americans there, but he's not central to their story. Who does matter is the local leader, the one who works with the snake activist in that instance. More often than not, women are these historical actors. And you also see different kinds of activism, right? It shapes us to think about who's driving change beyond simply the people who are sitting in at lunch counters and getting blasted by fire hoses and giving the speeches. A community might have the same sort of mass nonviolent demonstrations, but it might also, their story might hinge on a court case, on a community organization, on a local election, right? There's different ways in which political progress can be achieved. And when you get down on the ground, you see it in different ways. We might also consider this idea of a long civil rights movement. It's intimately connected to the idea of these local movements, right? That the civil rights movement doesn't arise in a vacuum. And it's not just Southern, but it's national. And it stretches well beyond the boundaries of the 50s and 60s. It's driven by Black migration. It's driven by the activism on the left, in particular, of unions who are getting involved in civil rights activity in the 1930s, which they're interracial in nature. It's driven very much by World War II, when you're combating fascism abroad, when you're fighting against Hitler's racist regime, and what does that mean to fight racism at home? In these leftist political circles in the late 40s and early 50s that eventually get sort of driven under by the Cold War. But these are sort of the centers of civil rights activity prior to the Brown years. And so there are scholars who emphasize that, right? The civil rights wasn't just simply something that popped into the Black minds. Oh, we should come, Jim Crow's wrong. We should deal with it now in the middle of the 1950s, but rather that it stretched further. And also, this is a story that then stretches beyond 1968, right? Where you can look, for instance, at key court cases or key pieces of people entering into politics in the 1970s that shift the political conversations. And this has kind of implications for what you might call a usable past. The idea that, if we understand the civil rights movement is more ongoing, if we don't understand it is just centered around King, then it gives us a leg into the civil rights movement. It gives us a grasp of that time and connects us to it. And it's not just men, right? This is a story where women are central. Women in some ways are written out of the civil rights movement. If you think about the March on Washington, for instance, there are 10 speakers that day, none of whom are women. Daisy Bates, who's the head of the Arkansas NAACP, says a few words. They introduce Rosa Parks, but it's just sort of like, hooray for women, and that's that. It's men who are in the popular imagination of the 60s, most associated with the movement, usually. Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and Stokely Carmichael and so on. Yet, when we study the civil rights movement, we see the central roles of women. Just think about how Charles Cobb was writing about Ella Baker, the woman in the center here, right, who was a key architect for thinking about sort of how grassroots political change occurs. She was the one who urged SNCC to become its own organization. She was the one who helped to develop a model for, if you really want a community to change, you don't just come in with some charismatic leaders and preach equality and then blow town. Rather, you work with the local people. You figure out, who can we get to register to vote? Who can we run for office? Who can challenge this person to be to be the sheriff, to be the tax assessor? The kinds of things that shape life on the ground. You have Diane Nash as a central figure in SNCC. You have Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, where we'll talk much more about her in next week's webinar. Of course, Rosa Parks, who I mentioned at the beginning, right, who's held up as this icon, is a much more complex figure than we give her credit for. She was a woman who was active in the movement way before the Montgomery bus boycott. She wasn't just some tired seamstress. She worked for the NAACP. She had worked as an investigator in claims of sexual violence against Black women by white men dating back to the 1940s. She'd attended Highlander Folk School, which was this school to train people in nonviolent direct action. After the boycott, she moves to Detroit, and she associates herself more with radical politics. She says that her political hero, she admired Martin Luther King, but her political hero was Malcolm X. So that's not the popular image that we have, for instance, of a Rosa Parks. But what's also really worth emphasizing when we think about the roles of women is that when you get down to the grassroots level, women are more active in numbers often than men, particularly in rural places. They are sort of the backbone of the movement. A lot of people who are in those pews at a mass meeting, singing the hymns and then getting in line to register to vote are women. So women are not just, you don't just add women to the story. When you understand the roles of women, you start to understand the civil rights movement in some new and different ways. A couple last points. And thinking about sort of the other ways of thinking about the civil rights movement. One is through international politics. Understanding that what is occurring in the United States is not occurring in a vacuum, but is connected to a larger world, right? So one example of this is the larger global struggle of the Cold War. What does the Cold War mean for civil rights at home? It's kind of a double-edged sword in this way. On the one hand, the Cold War is a weapon for the civil rights movement. They say, look, we're combating, the United States is looking for allies in its democratic struggle. This is at a time when there's newly independent nations in Asia and Africa. And so for the United States to discriminate against its citizens at home would be going against the American vision. And there's a lot of power in that. For instance, the NAACP writes about this very issue in its brief for in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. The State Department will pressure the federal government to pass civil rights legislation so that they're not embarrassed politically. But at the same time, any activity within the civil rights movement that is seen as sort of combating economic justice, that is sort of more human rights oriented, if you're talking about a right for housing or a right to a job, those get tarred as socialist, as radical, as communist, right? And so it confines the civil rights movement in some ways as well. But in thinking about sort of global politics and how it shapes Black activists, think about Martin Luther King and how deeply influenced he was by, for instance, the nonviolent tactics of Mahatma Gandhi in India, but also by the African independence movements. After the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the places that he travels to is not just India, but also to Ghana, the first independent nation in Africa in the midst of the anti-colonial struggle in 1957. And as the more African nations have become independent in the late 50s, and especially in 1960 and 1961, Black Americans look to that and say, look, here's a model of Black self-determination. We should be following that too. In the Black Power era in the late 60s, right, you see more of this sort of vision of what you might call third world liberation. They identify, for instance, with the Palestinian struggle in the Middle East. And then, again, we think of the civil rights movement as nonviolent, but there's also this tradition, what we call armed self-defense. Is it a myth of nonviolence? I don't know if it's if that's fair to say, because of course there's so many nonviolent campaigns. But in rural areas in particular, there's long traditions of if someone's shooting into your home, like it doesn't pay to be, it doesn't make any sense to be nonviolent. You have to shoot back or you're going to die. In a poll done with African Americans in 1963, they say, do you think ultimately violence will be necessary to achieve freedom? 22% say yes. Now that's a minority, but it's still a significant chunk. We have examples such as Robert F. Williams, who was an NAACP leader in North Carolina in the early 1960s, who wrote a book called Negroes with Guns, in which he argued that, look, African Americans have to defend themselves if they want to achieve any type of real equality. In Louisiana, there was an organization called the Deacons for Defense and Justice that worked with nonviolent demonstrators, but they were frustrated they were constantly getting attacked by the police, by the Klan. So they would guard the marches with arms. They would patrol Black communities. They would engage in shootouts with the Klan. So they were not attacking aggressively, rather they saw that freedom, equality meant defending yourself. And finally, this idea of Black Power, right? Black Power, not just as the bad guy that killed the civil rights movement, but rather Black Power is something that grew out of the civil rights movement. The same Southern activists who engaged in nonviolent demonstrations in the early 1960s, who worked for democratic reform, are often also the same people who proclaim the idea of Black Power and don't see those goals as contradictory. So they say we're always trying to empower Black people. Sometimes from a white point of view, they think of the civil rights movement as about racial integration, as about Black people folding into white institutions. But for many African Americans, their perspective is that the civil rights movement was about empowering Black people. And so they see much more continuity between Black Power and civil rights than they're given credit for. And Black Power takes all sorts of forms, right? In like, for instance, Stokely Carmichael, who becomes very associated with the Black Power movement and sort of its key spokesman in the late 60s, consensually defines it in political terms. He argues especially of the idea that wherever Black people can wage a political majority, whether that's in a northern city or whether that's in the rural Black Belt in the South, they need to band together and basically create their own political parties and wield that kind of power, which they can leverage against others, right, to articulate their own agenda. But Black Power also has cultural implications. The idea of Black is beautiful, the idea of to take pride in your history, to take pride in your culture, to take pride in the Black, in a Black style and appearance, right? These are all sort of elements that are connected to Black Power. If you think about the Black Panthers and there are notions of self-defense, if you think about a group of an idea like Kwanzaa, which really develops out of a Black Power organization called US, These are all sort of firm ways of affirming a kind of identity that sort of the classic liberal ideal of the civil rights movement could not. So I see that there's a lot in the chat, and I'm looking forward to that, and I'm also looking forward to hearing your questions and trying to engage in a good discussion. I did write down some questions to consider, right? And these are just sort of connecting some of the things that we've talked about. In telling the story of the civil rights movement, should we focus on the South? Why or why not? These are the questions that might interest your students. Should we think of the civil rights movement as confined to the 50s and 60s, or should we think of it in broader ways? Everybody knows Martin Luther King, but how should we understand his role? The more we can understand him and understand exactly what he brings to the table, maybe that helps us see the broader movement too. Should we think of the federal government as an ally or an opponent to the civil rights movement, or both? What do we, when we look at the roles of women, how does it change what the movement looks like? Are we right to see the civil rights movement as nonviolent? Is Black power constructive? Is it destructive? Is it both? And in the end, why does it matter? Why does it matter how we tell the story of the civil rights movement? What are the stakes? What does it mean for this idea of a usable past? If we can get our students to think about why different interpretations matter and what their larger significance is, maybe that leads us down the path of engaging them in historical study in new and hopefully fruitful